Dan slept on the pavement, his graying red hair a matted nest. He had plastic bags to combat some of the cold, and a now empty bottle of bourbon to drink away the rest. He was 39 and unsure about going further than that. The breeze blew through him. He moaned. He would give anything to be back in Donna's house. He didn't care that it smelled like ferrets. He had gone 3 months without a home. It felt like 10. Headlights shone in his eyes. Dan had the strange impression that the car was driving for him. He was right. The car pulled to a stop at the end of the alley. It waited. A window rolled down, and a dark, serious face leaned out of the void. He spoke to someone in the car.
"What about him?"
A voice responded which Dan couldn't hear. The door swung open on all sides. He imagined climbing to his feet, grabbing his grocery bag of Hostess cakes and running. The arms grabbed him and stirred him from a triumphant dream.
"My cakes,"
he mumbled as the needle stabbed into his thigh. Dan woke up in a hospital bed. Tubes punctured his arms, and empty baby food cans lined the bedside table. An IV bag dripped blood into him. He tugged out the needle, kicked off the sheets, and stumbled for the door. It was locked. He banged on the metal.
"Let me out! Out!"
The team watching the video feed stirred. No other patient had summoned so much energy on the first dose. The first person Dan met from the team was Gary. He was big enough that if Dan should struggle or get violent, he would hold him off. He was balding, but the fledgling ponytail sprouting from the back of his skull assured Dan he was not someone to fear.
"You haven't told me why I'm here. Am I crazy?
"You're not crazy," said Gary.
Am I in trouble?
"You're not in trouble."
So, why?
Gary twisted his mouth to the left, then the right. He clapped his hands over his crossed legs. "Have you ever wanted to learn photography?" Melissa was the second team member to introduce herself. She was in her 50s, growing out her bangs, so thin she reminded Dan of a wet cat. With Gary standing guard, Melissa delivered Dan's 3 daily meals and hooked up more IV bags. She complimented Dan one day.
"You're adjusting very well."
Thank you.
Dan said. The food was good, the bed soft, and he hadn't wanted a drink since he arrived.
It helps that you're all so nice.
Melissa frowned.
I meant about the blood. You're taking the doses better than the others.
Nelson was the last person Dan met before the launch. He had a cauliflower ear, which he pinched while setting up Dan's camera.
Ooh, it's a little old, so you have to be careful. Have you ever used a camera before?
Dan refrained from rolling his eyes. Though he was untrained, in his life before, Dan used to take headshots.
Yes, I've used a camera.
Right, show me.
Dan saw the time on Nelson's watch. It would be sunset.
If we go outside, we could get some beautiful shots right about now. Golden hour.
Nelson's eyebrows jumped, so Dan did know something. They sank back down, and he bit his cheek.
Ugh, going outside will be a problem, I'm afraid.
Dan did the best he could. He took a picture through a window, a tree framed by metal bars. Nelson looked at it on the 2-inch screen for a minute, then noticeably relaxed.
All right. Looks like we can skip the lessons.
Dan didn't know why he had been taken. The gray walls and unswept corners had a uniquely government feel. Perhaps this was all a study on combating homelessness. Maybe it was about alcoholism. He worried about being rejected from the program, whatever it was. He had not revealed everything about himself. He could not lose another home. The worries hit a peak during his physical. Melissa drew Dan's blood, checked his blood pressure and reflexes, and asked a litany of questions, the strangest of which was, "Have you ever had a spiritual experience while on drugs?" Melissa checked him all over and didn't make a single remark. Dan waited sick to his stomach for days, certain every time Melissa came with an IV or dinner, she'd be turning him away. When he finally asked Melissa, it came out angry.
You haven't said anything. Did I fail? Am I still a part of this study?
Melissa was taken aback.
What? Of course. You're progressing great. Better than expected.
The relief came all at once. Dan's eyes watered.
So it's okay I'm trans? You won't kick me out?
Melissa looked stricken.
You want to stay?
She relaxed her tone, seeing the shame flash on Dan's face.
Of course you can stay. We want you to stay. Actually, the most successful trials have been with trans subjects, but no one has done as well as you.
She smiled at Dan, then looked at the floor.
All the same, I wouldn't discuss it too widely, especially with the top brass.
Nelson told Dan the good news, rubbing his ear.
Put on your nicest shoes, Danny. The general gave you permission to go outside.
He waited for more of a reaction, but Dan was caught on the first part, the general. So this was military. Before Dan could go outside, Melissa dressed him in a full-body rubber diving suit, complete with a respirator mask and goggles. Dan was slick with rubber sweats as Gary and Melissa led him to the first of the doors. The lock was a valve, and the door popped when Gary twisted it open. Only Dan wore a suit, a fact that unnerved him as all three walked into the next room. Air blew in, and his ears popped. Outside, the sun was on the verge of setting. Every leaf of grass shone. The birch trees stood proud as Roman pillars. It was difficult to hold the camera through the gloves, feel the air through the rubber, but even through the goggles, Dan appreciated the natural light. He took a shot of Melissa staring at the grass. In the golden rays, her freckles came alive. He took candids as Gary pulled at branches, muttering scientific names. He looked like a saint. Dan thought he missed the grass and sun, but over 3 hours outside, every photo he took was a portrait. Melissa printed the photos that night. They drank beer and had a private exhibition in the cafeteria. Gary loved his photos so much he asked Dan if he could keep it. When they bid him good night, it was like saying goodbye to friends. Dan was not allowed to see his new camera. Nelson spent 5 days teaching Dan about it without so much as a picture for reference. He made Dan practice on a raw chicken. He was instructed to squeeze, massage, and pinch. Nelson refused to answer a single question.
You'll understand when you see,
Nelson said. The next day, Melissa made Dan take a tablet of Valium 20 minutes before the introduction. Despite his confusion, he felt loose and comfortable. Nelson carted a refrigerated cooler into the room.
Get ready, mentally.
From the container, he lifted a gray-pink rectangle with the texture of a giant callus. Dripping in his hands, it looked as if it were moving until Dan realized it was moving.
What? What is...
Meet your new camera.
He placed it between Dan's knees on the bed. It pressed warm against him, quivering. Despite his high, Dan squealed and tried to kick it away. Nelson grabbed the quaking thing with the panic of saving an infant.
Careful!
He pet it for comfort, and its fleshy contusions smoothed. He twisted it so Dan could see from the other side. One face was stretched with a wet lens, and through the pupil, Dan saw a reflection of the world. He handed it back.
Try again.
Maybe it was the drugs, the training, or the worried look on Melissa's face, but Dan forced himself to behave. He wrapped his palms about the camera. He could feel a weak, erratic heartbeat. He repeated the gestures from before. At a squeeze, the thing tingled. With a light massage, the eye cone changed shape. When he pinched it, the whole fleshy bundle flinched in pain and unseen lids flicked over the eye with a sound of squished jello. Horror caught up all at once. Dan threw the camera to the floor, his palms slimy with a substance that smelled like fennel. Nelson yelled at him, but Dan didn't care. If he heard anything, it was the lonely whimpers of the camera. It wasn't used to rejection. Dan had come to like Gary. He was gentle, polite, and patient. It hurt Dan almost as much when he clubbed Gary with a toilet lid.
I'm sorry.
He told Gary's unconscious body.
Please don't get a concussion.
He stole Gary's keys and escaped his room. It never occurred to him how empty the facility was. No guards, no other patients. After wandering the halls, he finally spotted the sealed doors. He twisted at the valve, and the door popped open with a gasp. He tore at the next valve without any pressurization, and felt his eyes sucking out of his skull as the door belched open. He could not hear the voice screaming,
No, Dan!
behind him as he stepped out into the world. Dan took a deep breath and collapsed at once. The air was not how he remembered. It boiled in his lungs, stuck in his throat like fishing hooks. His eyes burned, and his lips, his fingers, his cheeks, he twisted in pain and fought the hands trying to lift him like a wounded animal. Melissa pulled him inside and spun the valve of the door closed. She tapped buttons, shouting the whole while, but Dan heard only sizzling. The air pressure equalized, and the smell seemed to change. The pain lingered, but in the treated air, he could breathe again. Melissa was blurry through Dan's red, scorched eyes, but he saw the researcher crying.
You could have died!
After the assault of the air, Dan's words pained him.
Then let me.
Melissa just shook her head.
You're the only one who's come this far. If you die,
Her face twisted in rage.
they'll take someone else. And they'll die like all those people before you. How many more until we find another you?
She put a hand to Dan's cheek, and her touch cooled the burning skin.
It has to be you.
Dan recovered for 2 weeks. With each successive blood bag, his skin began to turn gray, mottled with pink. When he was well enough, Melissa wheeled him into the boardroom. He was ready to meet the rest of the team. Dan didn't see most of their faces just yet. They were military, he knew that much from the uniforms, the stiff backs, the lack of emotion in their speech. The moment he entered the room, his attention fell on one person and one person alone, the vice president. He couldn't help but glare, struck dumb. He was actually here. Those smug, wrinkled eyes, the robotic distance in his gaze, that suburban pervert smile. No wonder Melissa had warned Dan about staying silent. The administration was vicious to the trans community, and if there was a face Dan's put to its weaponized hatred, it was the vice president's. "You've passed the prior rounds of testing," said a man Dan assumed to be the general. He had the haircut. "It's time we fill you in on the specifics of the mission." Dan assumed someone would speak after that, but it was silent.
So, what is it?
To his dismay, the vice president looked him in the eyes. He smiled that vacant, thin-lipped grin.
It's simple. We're going to take the first photo of God.
Days passed, and Dan still couldn't believe it. He hadn't believed in God since high school. Yet it didn't matter whether he believed or not. The team did, even Melissa. Dan interrogated her at the next transfusion.
What's in the blood?
Well, we don't all the way know.
Melissa said, hooking up the new bag.
What's on the other side of the portal isn't exactly matter. Just entering God's realm gives anything from our universe an allergic reaction, but on an atomic level. So, just like an allergy, we have to build your tolerance. Every day you get a little more blood that's been exposed to God.
It's from the last person you sent, isn't it?
Melissa nodded.
So, they saw God?
Maybe. We couldn't ask them.
Dan recalled a Sunday school lesson from 30 years ago.
Moses saw God. The Bible says his face glowed after. What really happens?
Melissa frowned.
You burn.
The cords in her neck went taut.
We're trying to avoid that.
Before she left, Dan had one last question.
Does the VP know the first person to see his God is trans?
This time, Melissa did not answer, but she smiled. Dan practiced with the new camera over the weeks. He learned to be quiet around it. The slimy residue from before was a nervous defense that he could avoid with gentle touch and slow movements. The biggest challenge was composing the shot through a reflection. He couldn't look through the living camera like a synthetic one. He had to plan his shot using what appeared in the pupil, his back to the subject. Staring into its eye for so many days, he couldn't help but bond with the camera. Dan gave it a name, as well as gender. His name was Grippy. He had a small range of emotions, but enough to make him seem alive. Grippy delighted with subdermal squeals when Dan picked him up. He recognized his touch. Dan suspected he was as sentient as a hamster. He was cute in a tragic way. Most cameras couldn't die.
Why does he have to be alive?
Everything we send has to be alive.
Nelson said. He rubbed his ear.
And I mean everything. 3 years ago, they sent a chimp, just a dip into God's domain, in and out. Well, it comes back, hair burning like spilled acid, skin sloughing away, screaming. Hair and skin. Think about it, even dead cells can't survive. Only the living, the pure, can stay.
Dan was thinking about this when Melissa came into his room late at night.
I know why they picked me.
Why?
They needed somebody no one would miss. And they're right.
He told Melissa.
Someone will miss you.
Melissa said, voice breaking.
Don't ever say that.
The two of them went silent, their closeness suddenly noticeable. Dan grew warm, and Melissa placed her hand over Dan's. She squeezed.
I have something for you.
She opened Dan's left hand and placed a single green pill inside. It felt oddly heavy. Dan gasped.
No.
If you don't want to do this, you don't have to. I should have never said you're the only one.
Her voice strained.
I should have never put that on you.
But I am, aren't I?
Melissa would not answer. Dan threw the pill across the room.
You don't think I have the guts?
I just want it to be your choice.
I have a choice.
He said.
I have to choose how the world sees God.
Dan and the team flew in a chartered plane to Mumbai, India. The portal appeared in the Shivaji Nagar region. At one toilet for every 150 people, it was a teeming microcosm of bacteria, human life, and insects. Melissa tried to explain some of the proposed physics. The portal could only appear at a super density of life, a conscious wormhole to a living dimension. She tried to explain how trace radiation of the Big Bang was discovered on both sides of the portal. Dan just tried to sleep. 4 teams arrived in the portal facility to join the 5th team, which had constructed it. Dan was confined to his room, but even through the steel walls, he could hear the beeps of vehicles, the screech of gas-through perfectures, a strange rumbling below his ear's threshold. Melissa had Dan begin the highest concentration of the exposed blood. His head swam, and his ears began to weep hazy fluid. His skin lost all color. Dan felt like he was dying, but he already knew the truth. This was a one-way mission. The day of launch, all the teams assembled in the portal containment room. The portal's exact location could shift by meters, dependent on the fluctuations of nearby life. They stabilized it by positioning hollow plexiglass walls, each buzzing with anthills and fly swarms. God saw no difference between bug and man. Electrical components didn't work well near the portal. Everything was natural. Candles, wood, every instrument replaced by human minds, pens, and paper. It felt pagan. The members of the equipment team fit Dan with his suit. Like the camera, it was alive. A stretched fabric of gray-pink splotched skin, warm to the touch. A pair of external lungs hooked over his shoulders, inflating and pumping with wet suction. Dan felt the blood chugging through the capillaries all over him, a sensation like sinking inside your own body. Melissa stayed by Dan's ear the entire time.
Keep still. Almost done. Okay, hold your breath as they fix the mask. It's a very fragile membrane. Don't touch it. You're doing great.
Operators watched from catwalks and shouted orders. Dan saw yarmulkes and rosary beads, collars and robes and beards. Go time! Go time! Dan's team maneuvered him into the loading bay. The portal was a narrow slit, a floating knife slice through the air, leaned too far to either side, and it disappeared from view. It glowed in a wreath of dark light, separating into waves of ultraviolet, rainbow, pure black, and colors Dan could not see. It made his field of vision ripple, too unnatural to behold. Melissa and Gary held him arm by arm and marched him closer.
Today's a blessed day,
said a voice Dan recognized. He followed everyone's eyes to see the vice president standing on the catwalk, mouth to a megaphone.
God made us all in His image, and today a fair man of His own creation will meet God again.
Dan could hear the way the VP capitalized the G in God, the H in His.
Our God has been attacked by atheists and the socialist left for too long. Today we remind the world what God looks like. Father, prepare us so we might meet you. Amen.
Dan could see the image in the VP's mind. The white robes, flowing beard, the pearly white skin. His God was a version of himself, but unstoppable. If Dan believed anything, it was that his mind could not do God justice. But it would have to soon enough. Sirens blared, and Nelson approached Dan with Grippy. The lungs on his back respired, and cold air pumped into his mouth. Nelson handed him the camera, who wheezed and shook happily in his arms. He squeezed Grippy to his chest. At least he wasn't doing this alone.
He has just enough life to take one photo and come back. We can't say the same for you. Make it count.
Nelson told him, tears in his eyes. A countdown began at 100, and everyone moved into place. Sirens blared, lights flashed.
Dan,
the vice president said from above.
You are the new Moses. Ascend the mountain. Approach God with all your flesh, with all your life, with your camera. Through your eyes, the world will see its maker. Dan, man of all men, please go and behold God the Father.
Melissa squeezed Dan's arm, so tight it hurt, and even over the chug of lungs and the sirens and the chatter of the teams, he heard the woman cry. Dan stood feet away from the portal, now alone except for the camera in his hands. Unsure why he did it, he turned to the vice president and blew a kiss. He stepped through. Where Dan had expected black space, he saw an eternal white void. Where he expected a sea of glowing stars, he saw dark clusters like cancerous moles blooming near and far. The same glow he saw around the portal radiated from each floating mound, an aura of every color and not color. They all rippled in his mind at the edge of comprehension. He spun around and saw a massive oozing bundle right behind him. The portal was inside it. He had merged from within, and this close, it stank. Heaven smelled like rotten spinach. His body began to burn beneath the suit. They had shaved his head, but did not think to remove the hair from his arms, the inside of his nostrils, which now sizzled in pinpricks of agony. Dan twisted in pain and shouted, but no sound left his mouth. He gasped for air and found none. The lungs on his back pumped and pumped and pumped, and finally a spurt of fennel-reeking air squirted through the umbilical to his mask. Each sniff was heavy, sagging into other neurological sensations. It smelled like grief, like memories of lost pets, closed doors, and goodbyes. Something pressed firmly against his chest. He squeezed Grippy and rubbed below his eyelid gently. The camera was right. He had to focus. At first, Dan did not see God. He was looking for something larger, but no matter where he turned, he did not find him. Then he saw it, not a him, but an it. God was not a gendered thing, and it was not human, but it was familiar. It twisted between two of the tumorous dark mounds, but it did not move. Could this dark, narrow tube be God? Dan inserted Grippy into an outer skin pouch, which was difficult. The ether he sat in was viscous. He did not float so much as stick, like a plum suspended in pudding. He tried a breaststroke and made slight progress. He kicked his legs, beat his arms, and inched closer. He quickly exhausted the fennel air and choked as the lungs slowly pumped to supply more. Dan worried God might be as distant and large as a sun. He could travel miles and it would stay the same size. He was wrong. Within a few hours, its features became clearer, though he still could not tell head from tail. If there was any analog for what he saw, it was this. God was a worm. Massive, yes. Otherworldly, of course. Its features rippled in Dan's mind, sank into other neurosensations like hunger and lust. As unpleasant as it was to the eye, it curdled desire deep inside his gut, an addiction just waiting to happen. But it was a worm, all the same. Dan did not take the photo at first. He needed to know his subject. Dan swam as close as he could before he thought his arms might give out, his breath go too shallow. His ears grew wet. He was hemorrhaging by now. Dan lifted Grippy to his face and looked into his eye. He tickled the camera, encouraged Grippy's eye to zoom and zoom. God filled the entire frame, and Dan could inspect its features better. God did not move, and its skin did something similar to what Dan's tried to do under the suit, what it would do in time. Its darkened flesh flaked away, hung in the ether like dander. God was decomposing because God was dead. Dan could not tell how long it had been dead, but with a glance he could gather the reason. The cancerous black anti-suns blooming throughout the expansive inverse universe were not as mysterious as stars once were to mankind. God made them. Dan could see the most recent, smallest bundles, each in a line to the dead worm's anus, one stuck mid-expulsion in rigor mortis. Or perhaps it was its mouth, because a similar bundle was clogging the other end. The lungs began to struggle in the ether, and Dan's thoughts grew thin. Which end was up? Were the dark, tumorous anti-suns food or waste? Dan decided they were both. There it was, a tidy solution to how something could come from nothing. It didn't. All God had to be was a frictionless bowel, whose food perfectly became waste, whose waste perfectly became food. God the worm shat out universes only to gobble them back up, net energy zero. Until, that is, it choked. Dan thought about the vice president, and he laughed. It made him pass out, but he woke with a smile on his face, high from hypoxia. He looked into Grippy's pupil. The god worm looked massive. He zoomed back, but even this seemed too close. This was not right, not honest. He kicked his legs, propelled himself slowly backwards. God shrank in the living lens of the camera. Dan sucked at the umbilical for air, but none came. The lungs on his back quivered, then failed. At once, the flesh began to crumble on the mask, the umbilical, and the lungs burning away into floating ash. Nelson had been wrong. Not everything here was alive. The dead could stay as long as it took them to decompose. How long ago had God died? When would all trace disappear? Dan swam back farther, trying to position himself. His body ached for oxygen. He pulled Grippy to his face. Dan looked into the eye's reflection. Debris from his lung pack floated into his frame now. He let it stay there, just a sliver, but enough to place God, humble it. He thought of the tree he photographed through the barred window. He pinched, and the eyelid flicked shut. In the eye, Dan could see the disintegration, the obstruction, the genderless inhumanity of it all. In a way, the VP was right. God had made us in his image, a senseless thing born to confusion, choking on its own waste. He threw Grippy towards the portal, felt burning overtake him as the suit grew cold. Dan spun back to face God. His lungs gasped at nothing, and his heart stopped. He closed his eyes, joining God in decomposition. From a perspective not so far away, each was nothing more than a pale blue speck in an endless void.